This week we are giving focus to AI, artificial intelligence, and how it is impacting the music industry. With me is violinist, educator, and researcher Rachael.drury, whose work explores music, technology, and the law. Rachael helps us to understand the challenges that are being faced by the music industry, the creatives within it, and the law with things like copyright. But she also offers some words of encouragement to help us ride this new technological wave. Here we go. Rachael.drury, artificial intelligence. What actually is it, and when did it first come on the scene?
It's a great question, and actually one that's really important, because what we think of as AI today, particularly in the music industry, is very different from what you might consider AI to be from a technological point of view. So AI or artificial intelligence is a broad term that refers to machines or software that can mimic human intelligence. So that might include things like learning from experience, recognizing patterns, solving problems, and in some cases, even making decisions. In the music world, that could be anything from Spotify's recommendation systems to a tool, as we're seeing today, that composes music on its own. But I think it's important to understand that not all AI is the same. There are different types of AI. And the kind of AI that we're seeing in music industry today is very specific and a very powerful kind of AI called generative AI. Going back to your question about when did it appear in the music industry, it's actually been around for quite a while, for decades, in fact, as early as the 1950s, when composers and computer programmers like Lejaren and Hiller were using rules-based systems and probability models to create algorithmic music, which is music that's generated following a set of logical mathematical rules, which again in music was not a new thing. That had been seen being done without using computational machines. For example, Mozart using a dice to choose what the next note of a piece of music should be. And then when we got to the 1980s, and then into the 90s, AI was being used in things like MIDI sequencing and music analysis, music retrieval, and symbolic composition systems, which were always within a controlled and human-defined environment and system. So we call those early systems symbolic AI because they were based on rules and fixed logic. But what has changed when we look forward to the AI that's being used today, what we call generative AI, they're systems that can create new content like music, lyrics, vocals, and they mimic human made work. That's their intention, that's their purpose. So generative AI means that the AI doesn't just follow rules, it actually learns patterns from huge data sets of existing music, like millions of songs. And this is because we now have two major advancements in computational abilities, which is machine learning, where a system learns from data rather than being explicitly programmed to do a certain task. So in music, that could mean training AI on thousands of chord progressions so that it can generate its own chord progression. And the more data it sees, the more refined the outputs are, the better the outputs are. And then we have deep learning as well, which is kind of where we started to see things get really serious or exciting, depending on what side of the coin you're on with what's happening in the music industry today. And deep learning is a subset of machine learning that uses artificial neural networks, which are basically loosely inspired by what the human brain looks like and how the human brain functions. So it's a computational model of the human brain in the simplest terms. And so they're trying to get the computer to learn and generate content based on what a human brain would do. So these deep learning networks, they allow the AI to learn multiple layers of patterns. So not just your chord progressions, but your melody lines, your harmony, your rhythm, your timbre, any kind of emotion, I guess, that you might want to include in the song. And it's this type of technology that's powering the most advanced tools that we're seeing today, like Suno, Udio, and OpenAI's Jukebox. And unlike traditional AI or the symbolic AI that I was talking about earlier, generative AI follows a set of instructions that allows it to learn directly from that data. So without the data that it's fed, it's unable to do the job that it's being asked to do. So it's completely reliant on data. And of course, we know that the big conversation around that is that that data set, those huge, vast data sets that are being used to train these systems, often include copyrighted music, which raises major ethical and legal questions around consent, compensation, credit, and that sort of permissive nature of copyright, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
So we've had a bit of a play around on Udio and Suno. I was playing so hard on Suno that I lost all my credits. I've just gone through a non-subscriptive avenue. And so these examples, just to make sure I put the copyright or the terms and conditions out properly for Udio, this song here, I just put in a description that I wanted, which was a cheerful indie rock, folk infused, mood boosting song. And Udio generated this for me. It's called Chase the Day, and it has done the artwork for me, which is two people walking down a street, it seems, between two buildings into the sunset.
Sunrise paints in the morning sky. Laughter dances in the cool breeze passing by. Footsteps echo on this empty street.
It's really not bad. And I have to say, when I played around with things like Suno and Udio, the most successful outputs are either dance music or country music. For some reason, country music, it has like, I don't know if it's a formula or the collection of instruments that are used, or I don't know what it is, but yeah, it doesn't sound too bad, does it?
And I did do a trance pop track that I wanted to be about an experience of insomnia. And I had Calvin Harris as sort of the inspiration for that. And this is what Udio came up with for us. It's called Waking the Night. And the song cover is like these weird textured diamonds in different shades of pink.
Lost in the lights, I can't close my eyes. Hoping for peace, but the night just went by. Rhythms are calling, the bedtimes and cries. Dancing through shadows beneath neon skies. Waking the night, feel the pulse of the sound. Chasing dreams lost, but new ones.
I mean, it's fine. I was feeling myself bopping around a little bit.
Yeah, if you heard that on your playlist while you were doing your washing up, you would think nothing of it, would you? And I have to say, what I found really interesting about that is you can hear the singer breathing.
You can, and I can hear her breathing more than I understand what words she's saying. So I would like her to work on her diction if possible.
Absolutely. I totally agree. But the fact that I could hear breathing made me think that sounds like I wasn't even listening to what the lyrics were, because I was like, that sounds like a human being. Yeah.
But is it as satisfying as actually sitting down and putting your feelings out on paper, coming up with these things yourself, problem solving in terms of the orchestration? I don't know.
Interestingly, Mikey Schulman, who is the creator of Suno, I think, he did a podcast interview similar to this earlier this year, I think, or maybe like late last year, talking about how wonderful Suno is. And in that conversation, he said, oh, you know, making music is so hard. It's so difficult to learn an instrument. Like, no one wants to put that kind of effort in anymore. That's why we're doing this. And I was furious listening to him, because I was like, does he not understand that part of being a musician, part of being a creator is the process of creating? I promise you, if you want to use Suno and Udio, great, go ahead, play around with it. Have fun. You will get bored very, very quickly unless you have a way of manipulating the output and you know, creatively playing around with the output. It's not as fun as creating something from scratch. It's not as fun as playing around with things and collaborating with people. And I felt like his comment was quite patronizing to people actually that have devoted their lives to what creativity is all about, which is the process. It's not about the output half the time. Of course, we like to make money, but actually it's about the process. Well, I'd like to know if your listeners have a play around with it, how quickly it takes them to get bored and go off and start writing a song somewhere else.
With these programs that are coming out, like you said, if they're creating us album covers, titles of songs, the song itself, these are obviously areas of the music industry that are being hit, that creators might be feeling a little bit of pushback or challenge. So, what other areas of the music industry and artistry are we finding is being particularly hit, and which areas aren't so much?
Yeah, so like you say, anything to do with recorded music or music production is being hit quite badly at the moment. Any kind of music worker who works in lyrics or composition, mixing, mastering, sound engineering, music distribution, sort of to a certain extent, artwork, anything like that are being hit pretty hard at the moment. And aside to that, we have issues with sync licensing and production music in that, you know, it's historically very difficult to license music for sync, because in today's music industry, obviously we see many songwriters involved in the production of one song, and then you've got not only the copyright in the song itself with all of those songwriters, but then the copyright in the recorded music as well. So it can be very complicated and quite a long process to organize licensing for sync for TV and film and that kind of thing, adverts. So the benefit, I guess, for many corporations or filmmakers, TV makers, and advertisers is that AI can produce you a song to your specifications within seconds, and you don't have to worry about, well, you don't have to worry too much about the licensing behind it, so long as you're paying subscription fees and things like that, and you're reading the terms and conditions of these services. Music creators, particularly songwriters and composers and anyone that owns master rights, are going to be really heavily affected by this idea of cheap production music that comes out of AI. And it's been predicted, it was always predicted to be the first area of music business that was going to be hit pretty hard by AI. And it seems that is the case from two perspectives. So one, production and library music houses that employ human composers to write production music that clients would come in and say, I need a track for a scene about blowing cars up, and then the production library says, oh, we've got this catalogue of songs here, choose one you like. Whether it's that kind of production house or whether it's a commissioned work, those production houses and libraries are asking their human creators to sign contracts that say, you can use my music to train AI. So I don't know exactly what's going on under the hood there, but I would imagine that AI companies are paying a license fee to production music houses to say, let me use all of your human created music as training data for our AI model. So that's one issue. And the second issue, of course, is that less clients are going to come to production music houses to pay big bucks for production music if they can get it for a quarter or an eighth of the price through an AI system and get exactly what they want through text prompts. So I think sync and production music are really, if they're not already suffering, then they will. Less impacted, of course, we've got live performance. There's always the argument that you can't replicate the emotional connection that you feel from watching a live performance, from seeing a human on stage or a bunch of humans on stage performing music. And I'll never forget the first time I heard, if anyone's interested to go and listen to, I think it's called Beethoven X. So it's Beethoven's 10th Symphony, which an AI was, a couple of humans worked with an AI to use some snippets of Beethoven's 10th Symphony that he'd left behind when he died. And they asked an AI to recreate what they thought the symphony would sound like based on these extracts. They've only ever, as far as I know, released it as a fully human performed version of Beethoven X. And of course, even the live performance of an AI generated piece of music contains the emotion and the interpretation of a human being in performing that music. So it almost comes across as more successful because it's got that human input in it. So I think, we've already seen in the last couple of years how much money people are willing to spend on live music. The Oasis reunion gigs recently obviously have been massively oversubscribed, and I've read of people spending over £1,000 on a ticket. Taylor Swift last year when she was in Liverpool and various other places in the UK, people are willing to pay hundreds and hundreds of pounds to see artists that they want to see. It's not even necessarily, well, partly about the music, obviously, but it's about the human behind the music that brings in that revenue for live music. So will live music ever be impacted by AI? Probably in some way. We're not entirely sure how yet. It might be that it becomes a hybrid thing where human performers are using AI in their performance. I don't know. But as far as that human connection with a performer is concerned, I think live music is fairly safe. I would say the high-end bespoke film scoring for the big Hollywood productions, like, the John Williamses and the Hans Zimmers of film music, are probably going to be okay for now, because I think the technology is not there yet to produce a 3-hour epic film score. And I thought it was interesting as well. I don't know if you've seen the recent Superman film that came out. I thought it was interesting they've gone back to John Williams's original Superman theme, which an AI couldn't do that. They couldn't come up with a theme like that. And Harry Potter as well, where those themes are used continuously because they're so effective and so beautifully written. So I think those high-end film scoring jobs will still be there. The concern with that is, how do you get the talent pipeline to that stage? When we lose, hopefully not soon, but John Williams or Hans Zimmer, composers have to learn their craft somewhere. And if there's no entry-level jobs in that area, then how do we find that talent? How do they grow their careers to the point where they're writing that kind of music? So we need to be a bit careful about that. And of course, instrumental teaching and ensemble coaching, I would like to say that is fairly safe, because it's very difficult to replace that human connection in a classroom and the immediate feedback that a human can give. And obviously, when you're learning an instrument or learning to sing, you are learning to perform, you're learning to be successful in that environment of live performance. I'd like to think you can't replicate the human connection that you have in the classroom, which is going to be needed to train you to be able to have that human connection on stage. So I think we'll see AI start to infiltrate all of these areas, but I'm hoping that they'll be less impacted, at least for now.
We have seen ABBA Voyage be quite popular, which is holograms, I believe, of the quartet doing their famous shows. Do you see that being something that takes over a little bit more? Are we going to be paying hundreds to see Liam and Noel Gallagher in holographic form rather than in the flesh?
Well, that's an interesting question. I actually did some research on holograms for my master's research. It was just before the pandemic hit, and the only show that I managed to go and see live was Whitney Houston hologram. But as part of that, which by the way was quite, it was a good night out. Everyone was enjoying themselves, but there was some quite weird things that would happen, like someone from the audience would shout something out to her on stage, and obviously she couldn't react to that because it's essentially a recording. That's essentially what it is. It's not even really a hologram. It's CGI, essentially. They use the motion capture suits, and they film someone imitating Whitney Houston. They were using her own vocals from recordings, as far as I know, but then they would CGI the image of Whitney Houston or the video of Whitney Houston, and that would be projected using very high-tech 4K Ultra HD type projections onto a screen. And you could just about see, it was like a sheet of gauze that sat at the front of the stage. So it wasn't even a hologram in the way we would think, the Star Wars type holograms. But what was interesting to come out of that research was I spoke to someone from BAST Hologram who was producing the Whitney Houston show, and several others. I think Maria Callas, Roy Orbison, and there were a couple of others as well that I can't remember off the top of my head. I think they were planning on doing one with Freddie Mercury, but then the COVID happened, and I don't think that ever materialized. But the interesting thing that came out of those interviews is that the next stage of developing that technology would be to introduce AI, which is how I got involved in researching in AI, because they want the holograms to be more interactive. So the example they gave was a Holocaust museum, I think in Newark or somewhere in the United States, where there was a hologram of a Holocaust survivor at the museum, and visitors could come in and talk to the Holocaust survivor by asking it questions. And AI was programmed into it to be able to respond to those questions. So they saw the next stage of hologram technology in the music industry being to introduce artificial intelligence so that the performance could be more reactive to what was going on in the room. What I think is interesting, though, in the context of your question is, yes, Aber Voyage has done very well, but we haven't really seen those types of venues and performances pop up in the way we thought they might have done 5 years ago. So yes, there's been a couple of Las Vegas shows, I think an Elvis one and a Michael Jackson one potentially, but it's seen as more of a novelty, I think, rather than a standard. There was some talk for a while about, I saw a demonstration on screen of a man talking into the camera. And as the man was talking to the camera was panning back very, very slowly. And you don't realize until the camera leaves the room and then turns direction slightly that the man is actually standing in a totally different room on a green screen stage, essentially. And what you'd been watching and listening to was actually a hologram. But it was so real. It was so real. I mean, obviously I was watching it through a screen, not live, but it was passable as a human being, you know. And there was talk for a while about maybe installing that kind of technology, that kind of hologram box, if you like, into venues around the time they were talking about sustainable touring and that kind of thing, where, for example, Coldplay, who are very big on their green touring, Coldplay, as an example, could go and play in a large venue that has one of these boxes in, say, London, and then hologram stream that performance to smaller venues across the UK. So they would do one gig in the UK with a live audience and stream it out to other live audiences in other venues. But of course, the technology is really expensive, and the size of the box that you'd need, the one that I saw on the demonstration was the size of one human. You'd need a box the size of a stage to make that work. So it's just never materialized. I don't know whether it's because of cost or lack of interest, but I think, you know, when we talk about the future of the live music industry in the context of AI, if holograms had their moment and didn't become a thing, I can't at the moment picture a moment in time where AI would disrupt the live music industry that much. But a lot of people didn't see generative AI coming at all. You know, 10 years ago, we wouldn't have thought we'd be where we are now. So it's very difficult to say, but if it's anything like the hologram craze that we had for a couple of years, I still think people are going to crave that human connection on stage. I don't know whether people would pay 30 or 40 pounds to go and see a hologram Coldplay, knowing that they're live in London. People might pay more money to go and see an artist that's no longer with us, potentially. And yes, that Whitney Houston concert that I went to was full, and people were having a great time. And I think there's a time and a place for that kind of gig. But from an AI perspective, I think that AI will be used in interesting and innovative ways in live performance, but I don't think it will replace the human performer. I wonder, you know, if Oasis had said a year ago, we're not performing live anymore, but we're going to put a hologram show on at the Co-op Manchester Arena or whatever it's called, whether people would have bought tickets for it, I guess we'll never know. I'd like to think that there's not as much monetary value for the artist because the technology is, first of all, very expensive. But I also think that, you know, artists, musicians, we become artists and musicians because we love performing. I mean, yes, there are composers who love creating, but if you're working in live music industry, it's because you love the feeling of being on stage, of being in front of an audience, of connecting with fans. You'd have to have a really good reason not to want to do that anymore, whether it's because you've retired or you don't want to pay the time and monetary costs of touring, whatever that reason is. And if there's still a fan base there, I understand, you know, things like Aber Voyage. If there's still a fan base there, then why not? I mean, if you think about grassroots venues and stuff, I mean, first of all, they're never going to be able to afford to install that kind of technology. But also it's grassroots. It's all about the new artists, the new genres, the up and coming. I always think of the Blossoms. They performed in a pub from Stockport, which is where I live, and they performed in the Blossoms pub round the corner, and that's why they're called the Blossoms. And I always think, people will always feel that affinity with localism and community. Yeah, I think it's just the story behind the artist is so important to music consumers. Locality, community, with Oasis and Manchester, or Blur and London, or whoever it is, Tom Jones and Wales, whatever it is, there's always that kind of pride. Oh yeah, that group came from where I'm from. I grew up with them. Or having a message like the Spice Girls and Girl Power, which was big when I was at high school, through the 90s. That was such an important message to young girls of that time who were of the generation where it was acceptable to be powerful and successful and have dreams and not just want to be married with kids and or that concept of being able to do it all. That was such an important message to girls like me who were growing up in the 90s. And I think so from a consumer perspective, that human connection and that story behind the artist is really important. And you don't get that by watching a hologram, unless it's nostalgia that you're looking for, because there is no other way of seeing them, like you say. But from a performer perspective, it is also about that connection. It's just a mutual relationship between artist and audience, which I don't think can ever be replaced by AI, and can't be replaced by hologram. Although I will say that the Whitney Houston show did have a live band as well. So she was the hologram, but there were live musicians there as well. So again, going back to the Beethoven X example, there's still some kind of human creativity going on stage, which kind of makes it okay, if you like, I suppose.
And if you enjoyed the Spice Girls, did you also enjoy Groovy Chick?
I don't know Groovy Chick.
You don't know Groovy Chick?
No.
What happened in the 90s? She was like I think she had blonde hair and she would wear pedal pushers and she'd be on stationery. She wasn't a musician. She was on your pencil case.
Oh, hang on. Did she kind of wear purple? Yeah, it's ringing a bell. It's ringing a bell. Yeah.
I love that. I didn't tell you it was pencil case to start with. It's like, what artist is that?
Yeah, I was thinking that. Who's this Groovy Chick you're talking about? I don't know.
So if we are live performers, what are the signs that we can be looking out for if AI is actually starting to impact us particularly?
Yeah, it's very difficult. And I will try and explain as best I can why it's difficult to see the signs. I think the obvious one is studio work. So recording work is probably where you're going to first see it. I would count that as live performance, even though it's not necessarily in front of an audience. It's a musician performer going into a studio environment to do their thing. So even though it's not live in that respect, quite often there's a crossover, isn't there, between live performers and musicians that go and work in a studio. We're already seeing session musicians seeing a drop in the work that they've been offered for studio work. So the example I'm going to give is not a UK example, actually. It was someone in the US it was the brother of someone that I know anyway. So it's a US example of a session musician that actually turned up to a studio to do a job that they booked. And when they turned up to the studio, they were turned away and said they decided to use AI instruments instead. So I think, if you're a performer who works in studio environments as well as live venues, you might see a little bit of a drop in studio work first. So that would be your first signal. Now, the reason it's difficult to discuss what signs you should look out for is because we're so dependent on a freelance economy in the music industry, particularly as performers, unless you have a job in an orchestra or a professional choir, perhaps, where you're paid a salary or you have a membership. The vast majority of performers in the music industry are freelance or self-employed. And there are many, many different factors that could affect the amount of work that you're being offered. It could be COVID, for example, was one, right? And that took a while for many people to get their work back to where it was pre-COVID. Brexit, of course, not being as easy to tour in the EU now as it was previously. It could be that studios don't have enough money to pay musicians to come in and record. There's a whole host of reasons why work might be dipping, or pay might be going down, payment rates might be going down. It's not necessarily AI. So it's quite difficult to look for signs as far as your own work is concerned, other than perhaps a decline in, like I say, session work. I think other things you can look out for, particularly from a music production point of view, is client expectations. So are clients expecting you to create work faster or for cheaper rates? If you find that work that's coming in is offering you less money, you've got to question why. Could AI have anything to do with it? Are there other options out there other than you that are cheaper? And you can keep an eye out on new roles that might be emerging in that space, such as prompt engineers or AI music supervisors, that kind of thing. And of course, then at the moment, we've got all the confusion with the ethical and legal considerations of AI music, which is being discussed. And that also has a backlash on licensing as well. So music streaming was discussed in Parliament last week, and there are some interesting things coming out of that, which are going to help heritage artists and to some extent session musicians and people who are commissioned to write songs for studios and for labels are going to see some concessions with day rate payments, subsidy payments and that kind of thing, which is always a positive move, right? So as people that work in the music industry, we need to be willing to keep our ear to the ground on what's happening in the music business and the music space. And I think keep an eye on where your work is coming from and what rates you're being offered. And if anything looks suspicious, ask the question, could it be something to do with AI? I don't know how helpful that is, because what would you do if you did find out it was AI? Like there's not a lot you can do. But I would say for now, I think people are probably okay in the live music space. But yeah, keep an eye on session work is what I would say.
Hey you! If you're enjoying the Singing Teachers Talk podcast, then don't forget to hit the subscribe button. We are committed to bringing you engaging conversations and valuable insights from experts across the field of voice. By subscribing, it means we can continue to do that. You'll never miss an episode, and you'll be helping to spread the word to other singing teachers, vocal coaches, and overall voice nerds. So subscribe to this channel now and just watch your teaching grow. In an article that you wrote named Making AI Work for Musicians, it was published in the ISM Summer Music Journal 2025, you expressed how copyright law is being pushed to its limits, and that, just to quote from that, the question is no longer whether AI affects musicians, but whether musicians will have rights in the AI age. Can you explain the current copyright law and how it's being tested by the government when it comes to AI and creatives in the industry?
Right now, copyright, essentially what copyright is, it's a piece of legislation that was introduced centuries ago in the early 1700s in response to technology, essentially. It's actually UK legislation introduced in the early 1700s called the Statute of Anne, that was introduced in answer to the printing press, so a form of technology that was disrupting the creative industries. And it was because writers would take their work to a printing press to print copies that they could sell, but the publishers or the printers wanted to reprint multiple copies of it and sell it to their own benefit. So copyright law was introduced to give the writer rights and ownership over the works that they were producing. So publishers or printers would have to pay a license fee, essentially, to the writer to be able to reproduce copies of their work. And since the 1700s, we've seen copyright adapt and evolve to different types of creativity, like music composition and performance, for example. And we've seen it expand to protect creators for longer, as a longer amount of years, for example. And it's always been about protecting the works of creators, like music, books, like news articles, lyrics in a song, that kind of thing. So it's essentially about protection, but it's also about monetization. If we break it down to its simplest elements, copyright is the right to copy and the right to prevent others from doing so. So the owner of copyright has the right to make a copy of their work, but they also have a right to prevent anyone else from doing so. If that person makes a copy without your authorization, that would be classed as copyright infringement, and the original creator can sue that person for damages. Or other people can ask you for a license, and as a creator, you can say, yes, you can pay me however much money and you can have a license to use my work for this purpose. So you're monetizing your own copies of your work and licensing other people to make copies of that work. And as I say, copyright has always been a permissive system, and it's always been about protecting creativity. So right now, UK copyright law mostly only protects human authored works. So you have to be a human that's created the work, and the work itself has to demonstrate an element of skill, labor, and judgment, which are the three words we use to describe creativity, essentially, in a legal context. The work also has to be original. So I'll come back to that in a minute about originality. And it also has to be fixed in a tangible form for it to qualify for copyright protection. So if you write a song, for example, it doesn't matter whether you're writing it down with a pen and paper, doesn't matter if you're using Sibelius to write your song, doesn't matter if you're just singing a melody into your phone and recording it. So long as that is fixed in a tangible form, copyright exists. And you own the copyright in that piece of work, and you have the right to prevent other people from using it.
Just from the offset, just without doing anything, it's automatically...
Automatic, yeah. You don't need to register for copyright. It's automatically applied as so long as it's fixed in a tangible form. Going back to the originality point, the threshold for originality is actually quite low in the UK. It just basically means not copied. So long as you haven't copied it from someone else or stolen anything from anyone else, then it's usually classed as original. When it comes to AI generated music, I will come back to the human authored thing in a minute and why there's a bit of an imbalance there. UK copyright law actually is one of the few in the world that potentially does offer copyright protection to AI generated works. It's called Section 9.3 of the Copyright Act, Copyright Designs and Patents Act. And it basically offers protection to computer generated works. So this was something that was introduced into copyright law for the Copyright Act that we use currently, which was 1988. So it was introduced in the late 80s, obviously before we knew what generative AI would look like today. So many people argue that it doesn't apply to generative AI. I would argue it could, and I think a lot of people would argue it could apply to generative AI. So Section 9.3 protects computer generated works in a similar way to how sound recordings are protected by copyright, in that there is no human requirement needed in the creative process. The work doesn't need to be original, because in a sound recording, obviously you are making a copy of an original song in order to make a sound recording. The sound recording itself is not original. The duration of copyright protection is only 50 years for computer generated work, which is similar to sound recordings. While there is no human requirement for authorship, there has to be human oversight in the ownership of copyright. So the copyright can only be owned by a human being. So in the case of a sound recording, that might be a corporation that owns the copyright as a legal fiction, as a corporate ownership, or it could be one human being. For example, if you were to make a sound recording in your own bedroom, you would be the master rights owner. Similarly, with AI generated music, Section 9.3 says that ownership, or authorship as they call it in the Act, would be attributed to the person who makes the arrangements necessary. And that's the same wording they use for sound recordings. In the case of sound recordings, usually the person who makes the arrangements necessary would be the person financing it, hence the label or the person who recorded it in their bedroom. And the wording is the same for computer generated works. So there is a case to be said that AI falls under computer generated works, in which case they could be protected under UK copyright law. The US does not have this clause at all. The EU countries don't have this clause at all. There are a few other countries in the world that contain similar provisions for computer-generated works, but on the whole, it's not a recognised clause in any Copyright Act. So this places the UK in quite a unique position, that there are legislative provisions for protecting AI-generated works if they are to be conceived in that way. The recent consultation on AI and copyright that closed in February of this year, 2025, we're looking at removing that provision. I would argue that there could be some benefit in keeping it, because we could potentially look at some form of compensation for human creators whose works are used to train AI models through what we would call a related right, which is what the protection of sound recordings is. It's not copyright, it's a related right. So copyright would be reserved for human authored works as it's always been intended, but there is potentially an argument for protecting computer generated works as a related right, a right related to copyright in the same way sound recordings are. Just to add to that, the other reason why copyright is being pushed to its limits currently is that as part of copyright protection, legislation does include copyright exceptions. So there are certain circumstances where the use of copyright protected works without permission would be okay in the court of law, depending on what that usage is for. So, for example, we have a fair dealing copyright exception that will allow the use of copyright protected works for things like news reporting or education, for example, or for personal research, that kind of thing. We also have a text and data mining exception, which is important in the context of AI. A text and data mining is basically where you send bots through the internet to collect data and mine it in order to train, in the context of generative AI, to train the AI model, which is what has caused controversy over the last couple of years. So there are AI companies sending web scrapers out to extract data or extract music from the internet or books or any kind of written creative works. They turn that into numerical data, feed it into their AI models. So essentially, music creators, their work is being used to train AI models that potentially could replace them in the future. So that's the controversial side of it. We already have a text and data mining exception in the UK that allows that to happen for non-commercial research. So, for example, if you're looking for a cure for cancer, or you're researching defense strategies or something like that, then text and data mining would be allowed for that purpose. What text and data mining currently isn't allowed to do is steal your work without permission to train for commercial use, which is, of course, what the platforms that we've discussed today, Suno and Udio, for example, have been doing and have openly admitted to being doing. The reason why copyright in the UK is being pushed to its limits at the moment is because the government at the end of last year proposed a new text and data mining exception that would allow AI companies to mine creative works to be used as data for training their AI models without asking permission, without paying a license fee, without providing any compensation for the fact that some of those models might be replacing their work in the future or creating derivative works from those composers and songwriters and creators.
But why is that the case? Because I know on a panel that you were on with the ISM, I think you were there with Vic Bain, Seb Cuttill, Dr. Anne Christian Glenster, and Aaron Desi. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Deskey, I think.
Deskey.
Yeah.
And Seb questioned the distinction between what is generally important for AI to know and what isn't. And I think he referred to, why does AI need to take the work of Dua Lipa in any way to facilitate the progression in a commercial use for drugs for cancer or whatever it might be? Why is that necessary to be done?
And this is one of the big problems that we have if we go back to the very start of our conversation about talking about what is AI, the umbrella of AI is very different from the little part of generative AI that we're looking at in the creative industries. So there are going to be uses of artificial intelligence in our future as a society, which will benefit hugely from a text and data mining clause that allows data to be scraped from the internet or from wherever it happens to be scraped from. Arguably, of course, an AI model that is training to create drugs for cancer, as you say, might only really need to scrape the data of academic journals or medicine magazines rather than the music of Dua Lipa. But this is where we have the problem, because legislation and regulation looks at generative AI as a whole thing for society rather than just what it's doing for the creative industries. So at the moment, they're trying to legislate on something that is going to be hugely beneficial for certain parts of society and certain new innovations in medicine and healthcare, for example, or defense is another one that's often talked about. But I'm not sure it's going to be hugely beneficial for the creative industries.
So is it more like it just doesn't have a filter right now?
Basically, yeah. I think the argument from big tech and AI companies is they just need data, any kind of data. We just want all the data. Dua Lipa, as wonderful as her lyrics are, I'm sure, are not going to cure cancer. We know that. Everyone knows that. I think government have quite a difficult job when legislating and regulating AI over the next 12 months to come up with a way that somehow distinguishes different uses of data without distinguishing between different types of creative works, if that makes sense. Because everyone still needs protection, whether you're an academic journal or a songwriter, you still own a copyright, and that right should be protected. And I don't know what the answer is. I was actually thinking this morning, maybe there needs to be a regulatory body like the Intellectual Property Office that deals purely with training data for AI. And AI companies come to that regulatory body and say, I need access to all the data that you have in the UK. And that regulatory body says, okay, what do you need it for? Oh, I need it to build a song generating platform. And at that point, the regulatory body goes, well, fine, you can have that data, but you have to pay this much money, or you need permission from these people. Whereas an AI company could come to the same regulatory body and say, we're working on an AI platform that's going to develop a successful drug for curing cancer. We need access to data. And at that point, that regulatory body says, okay, that's fine. You can have access to this kind of data and that kind of data, and tell me what your data needs are and I will make it happen for you, kind of thing. I'm sure it's not that simple, but, I think probably the answer is that copyright doesn't need to change at all. And actually, it should just stay as it is. And if you want to use creative works to, as you say, Dua Lipa, Ed Sheeran, Elton John, their works aren't going to cure cancer, but they'd be very good at training an AI to write music. Is that a good enough use of data to warrant getting it for free? No. My hope is that copyright law doesn't change. I hope that AI companies are pushed to play by the rules, and that the creative industries are allowed to enforce copyright, and that the courts back that enforcement up. And, I'm pretty sure that all of the creative industries are working on ways to license this data in a way that is affordable for AI companies, but fair in remunerating the people whose data and works are being used. The fear is that there's potentially a lot of money to be made from AI. I think potentially the financial gains in the UK are not as big as government think they're going to be, because all the big players are US companies. So I feel like a lot of the income that comes from AI is going to be fed back to US tech giants rather than staying in the UK economy. Time will tell. My fear is that the UK government is being fed a lot of nice sounding information about the financial future of AI and what that could do for the UK economy. And, tech companies are very keen they've said in the past that copyright should be scrapped altogether. There are arguments out there to say that copyright is not useful anymore. I think creators who rely on it for their livelihoods would disagree. And it has kind of forced the conversation of how useful copyright is moving forward. And are there other ways that music creators can make money, or any creative across the creative industries can make money? Do we have to be so reliant on copyright? The truth of it is, at the moment we are, and that's not going to change overnight. If they scrap copyright tomorrow, then it's going to be fairly devastating for a lot of people that work across the creative industries. The only other thing I would say is we need to look closely about what's happening abroad as well. It's not, unfortunately, just about the UK. We know, for example, that many tech companies are saying, if you don't introduce this text and data mining exception, we'll just go and mine your data elsewhere, because there's a thing called extraterritoriality, which means that a law can exist in the UK, but if that data happens to be on a server in the US, it's fair game there. And we know that the music industry is a global industry. So your music is going to be on servers and platforms in the US and elsewhere in the world. So any law that is put in place here, as far as protecting those works are concerned, only means it's protected in this country. So there's that issue to deal with as well. But we also need to keep an eye on, for that reason, we need to keep an eye on what's happening, particularly in the United States, but also the EU. The EU introduced the AI Act with provisions for text and data mining exceptions in the same way that the UK government are looking for, which, by the way, would change copyright from a permissive system where you always have the right to prevent other people from using your work unless you give them permission, to a system where you have to opt out of AI training, which turns copyright on its head completely. So it means that every time you create a work, rather than sitting back and knowing that work is protected, you then have to go and make sure that work says somewhere in its metadata, or however they decide it's going to happen, that you have stipulations attached to that piece of work that says you cannot use this for data training. And then you've got issues of transparency around that as well. How do you know if your work is being used in training data sets when AI companies are not transparent about the use of data? So there's all kinds of problems around that. Going back to the EU, they introduced this text and data mining exception with the opt-out a few years ago now, which is the option that the UK government seemed to be interested in pursuing. And there are now reports coming out of the EU that say, oh, this copyright exception was planned before we knew what generative AI could do in the creative industries, and so it's not fit for purpose anymore. And there's also been multiple issues with how do you implement an opt-out on creative works that are shared hundreds and hundreds of times across the internet on different platforms. It's just not a workable solution to the problem. So there's turmoil in the EU. And if we look at the US, it's just as bad, I would say. Trump tried to implement a clause in his Big Beautiful Bill that would stop states from legislating on AI for the next 10 years. That has been overturned by Congress, which is great to hear. But we know who Trump's friends are, and Trump's friends are anyone with lots of money in big tech. So he's got the tech industry talking in his ear about what they want. I think we just need to keep an eye on that, because, you know, even though we call the music industry a global industry and we have a UK music industry, a lot of the headquarters of the major labels, for example, are in the US. I would say anything that happens in US litigation is probably going to end up feeding through to what's happening here. And similarly with the EU as well, because we have a close, even though Brexit happened, we do have a close legislative relationship with the EU. So yeah, I would just add to our conversation on copyright that those are things we should probably look out for as well.
It seems really quite scary when we put it all like that, and like maybe there's something for us to worry about in the future. I mean, if you were to become Mystic Meg for a moment, if you're a 90s person, then you probably remember Mystic Meg from the lottery.
Yeah.
Love Mystic Meg. What's the timeline, do you think, of human versus machine? How long have we got to get our creative projects out there before the AI wave truly sort of takes over?
How long is a piece of string? I would say that once all of the legislative and regulatory stuff is worked out, which could take a year, it could take 2 years. I think once that underlying work is done, then we're going to see a huge push in the creative outputs of AI. We're already seeing generative AI be quite successful in the music industry already, but it's all been happening under the radar and in an underhanded way, in that, AI companies are scraping your data without your permission, whether you like it or not. It's happened. And some of them are very open about the fact that they've done that. Suno and Udio, for example, have openly admitted that they use copyright protected works without permission. And I think we're seeing, uses of generative AI creeping into streaming services, and it's everywhere. It's everywhere, whether you want it to be there or not. And it's under the hood of every major streaming platform. It's under the hood of your digital audio workstation. It's there.
How can we shift with the times then in a positive way? And how can we find these innovative ways to stay true and be artists and still share our creativity without this fear?
I think we need to look back at how useful other types of technologies have been in the past. I mean, not all of them have been positive, I have to say. But if you look at synthesizers, if you look at digital audio workstations, if you look at drum machines, if you look at electric guitars, if you look at the microphone, these are all disruptive technologies that change the creative process in their own ways when they came along. I mean, people hated that crooner Frank Sinatra sound when it first came up because they were using a microphone. People were like, no, this is terrible. You should be on stage singing. But look what we've got as an industry because of that technology and those capabilities. And yes, of course, with synthesizers, there are arguments that they replaced musicians in the West End. And, so not all the outcomes have been good, but also, part of the synthesizers brought us 80s music and new genres of pop music and arguably more musical theatre, because orchestras were more affordable. So there might have been less musicians in one pit, but there were 10 theatres showing shows. I don't know. I don't have the figures to prove or unprove what I've just said. But I think the point I'm trying to make is the music industry is an industry that has been shaped by disruptive technology, and AI is just the latest disruption. And it will become normalized. It will become a part of your Pro Tools or Logic or whatever digital audio workstation you're using. It will become as normalized as searching for samples and drum beats and using various techniques of mastering and mixing through GarageBand or whatever it is that you do. It will become as normalized as that. And I think the key thing is just not to be threatened by it too much, and leave the complicated and scary stuff to the legislators and the regulators, who hopefully will come through and do the right thing in the end. And if they don't, we'll deal with it. The music industry has always bounced back. You look at peer-to-peer file sharing, in the late 90s. And yes, streaming is not great, and we've had issues with streaming, but goodness knows where we'd be without it. And I think that's kind of the way we need to think about AI as music creators, as music practitioners, as music teachers. It's a technology that's going to be here for a long time. It's not going anywhere. It's becoming more and more integrated into everyday life, not just into music tools. And I think we just need to learn to embrace it. So we need to embrace co-creativity. We need to learn how to use these tools. We need to experiment with them and create ideas through them, and learn how to use them creatively rather than to do our creation for us, and reframe AI as a tool and not a replacement for creative. And also, find and retain value in human experience. So we talked a lot about live performance today, a collaboration, feeling emotion when you're creating. What are the human elements of what you're trying to do? Because a machine's never going to be able to do that. It's about connecting with yourself and connecting with other people and connecting with any value you can find in the human experience in music or any creative endeavor. and focusing on what can't be automated.
How do we still get people to be interested in learning an instrument and learning to sing when they could just go onto a computer and have it all sort of done for them? And is there any sort of music knowledge that you have to have as a basis in order to create something that is pretty good on these systems?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends what tool or platform you're using as to how much creative input or creative knowledge you need to be able to get something. I think most of the tools that we've talked about today, Suno and Udio, can pretty much do it for you. Whether you think it's any good it's all subjective, isn't it? What you sound good might not sound good to someone else, right? But it's no different to me liking 90s indie rock or Britpop bands, but someone else likes EDM. And there's a lot of house music out there that I, as not a fan of house music, would be like, this is rubbish. It doesn't actually mean it's rubbish, I won't name and shame, but I have family members who are real music snobs. Oh, you can't possibly like the Spice Girls. Well, sorry, but I do. It's like, and we all have different tastes and different levels of acceptability of what is good and what is not.
I really hope you went back to a family member, by the way, and then just popped out a, who do you think you are?
Yeah, I wish I had. That would be quite good. Beautiful singing, by the way. You could be in the Spice Girls. Anyway, going back to what we were saying, I don't think we should tell people not to play with these things if they want to, because if it genuinely isn't any good, then it will not make any money. I genuinely believe that. Like, we do have to be a little bit careful of streaming services that tend to put AI generated music in their playlists, which is another example of the underhand use of AI that I was talking about earlier. And you might not even realize that it's AI that you're listening to, which is why another thing that organizations like the ISM and UK Music and other various supportive organizations are lobbying for is the labeling of AI generated music, which I would like to see happen so that consumers have a choice. If you want to listen to AI generated music, great, go for it. But be informed that that's what you're listening to. Health music is a really big thing at the moment, and those kind of adaptive soundscapes that are generated by AI, I'm sure have their uses. I don't discourage people from playing around with them. If it means that someone that wouldn't normally have engaged with music is engaging with music, then that can't be a bad thing, I always think of, I do quite a lot of orchestral gigs of film music gigs where the audience is much younger than you might get at a Halle concert of Berlioz or something like that, And quite often these gigs sell out, so you get a full audience listening to John Williams and Hans Zimmer music. And it's always surprises me the number of people that will talk to me on the way back to the car park after the gig saying, I didn't think I was going to enjoy it as much as I did. What a fantastic experience. I'm going to come back and watch something else. If it just gives someone that wouldn't necessarily have had that experience in the first place a gateway into wanting to learn more about music, then that can only be positive. And then as educators, it's then our job to make sure that they're learning it in the best way possible with some human connection and understanding that these platforms are tools. They are not the answer to creativity.
Rachel, this is such a huge topic, and I think there are so many directions we could go in with it. And we've spoken about kind of getting you back on to talk about the ways that we can utilize this for good in our sessions, as well as maybe some of the updates that come out, because you're our inside gal. Thank you so much for giving up all your time and sharing this information with us. It's really helpful, and to kind of hold our hand through this new wave of AI. Where can people find out about you and get in touch with you?
Probably the best way is through the ISM, actually. I'm at a weird place in life at the moment in that I finished my PhD, which obviously was looking at all of this. And so I don't know where I'm going to be, really. And the only place where I know I'm definitely staying for now is with the ISM through their fantastic work and advocacy for musicians in the face of AI. They're doing some great policy work and campaigning work with government on all of the issues that we've talked about today. So I am working with them a couple of days a week. So I think if anyone would like to contact me directly, I can give you my email address at ISM. That's probably the easiest place.
Oh, that's amazing. We'll put that in the show notes, and then people can bombard you with their questions about AI and whether iRobot is going to come true.
And also, if any of your listeners, have had any experience with AI, negative or positive, I'd love to hear about it. So yeah, please do get in touch.
Oh, Rachael.drury, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And I hope it was useful for some people. Thanks, Alexa.
Listeners and viewers, a quick message to say that Rachael is going to be back with us in a few weeks' time to help us understand how we as teachers and singers can use AI positively in the work that we do. That means we just don't have to bury our head in the sand. So keep your eyes peeled, and we look forward to seeing you then.